The month was April 1945, and the great cities that once thundered with parades now burned under a gray, endless sky. Roads were choked with refugees, soldiers, and silence. In the chaos, the last line of defense was not made of men, but of boys. They wore helmets too large for their heads, rifles too heavy for their shoulders, and fear that no uniform could conceal. Across the wreckage of 1,000 shattered fields, the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, dug shallow trenches and waited for an army they had been told would show them no mercy. One of them was Hans, 13 years old, face still round with childhood. His hands trembled on a Panzerfaust as he crouched behind a stone wall outside a ruined Bavarian village. Around him, boys coughed in the cold mist, their breath pale ghosts in the morning air. They had been told the Americans would burn them alive, hang them, make them slaves. Their officers, gray and desperate, shouted words about honor and fatherland. But honor felt small when the ground shook beneath tank treads. The sound arrived first, a low, distant thunder rolling over the hills. Then came the metallic clatter, the rhythmic growl of engines. The boys' eyes widened. Someone whispered, "They're here." A few clutched grenades as though holding rosaries. Hans pressed his back to the stone, heart pounding. He imagined his mother, somewhere in the rubble of Munich, waiting for a son who might never return. He wanted to be brave. He wanted to believe what his schoolteacher had said, that dying for the Führer was a child's greatest duty. But he could not stop shaking. When the first Sherman tank appeared through the smoke, the boys fired wildly. The shots pinged uselessly off armor. The tank didn't even stop. A white star gleamed on its turret, strange and clean against the ash. Behind it marched men in brown coats, calm, methodical, their rifles low. An officer raised a hand, shouting something in English. Hans didn't understand, but his instinct, older than propaganda, told him to run. A boy beside him, no older than 12, stood up to throw a grenade. The blast from the tank's cannon came first. It wasn't meant for them. It hit a nearby wall, but the explosion knocked them flat. Hans's ears rang. Dust filled his mouth. When the smoke cleared, he saw the boy lying still, blood dark on the stones. The others broke. Their line collapsed, rifles clattering into the mud. Some cried, some fled. Hans stumbled to his feet, dropped his weapon, and raised his empty hands. The Americans approached cautiously. They were bigger, louder, but strangely human. One of them, a man with a red beard and tired eyes, motioned for Hans to come forward. Hans hesitated. He expected a bullet. Instead, the soldier pulled a bar from his pocket, unwrapped it, and placed it in the boy's hand. Chocolate. Sweet, rich, impossible. Hans bit it and nearly cried. He had forgotten such a taste existed. All across the countryside, scenes like this repeated themselves. Columns of frightened teenagers surrendered to men they had been taught to hate. Some still tried to fight, others collapsed in relief. American medics, expecting to find hardened killers, instead found children with lice, frostbite, and eyes too old for their faces. They bandaged wounds, offered water, and called them "kid." The irony was brutal. These boys had marched for a 1,000-year empire, and now they could barely stand. In one camp outside Nuremberg, U.S. soldiers rounded up hundreds of Volkssturm recruits, many under 15. The Americans searched them gently, afraid of booby traps, then realized most of their pockets held nothing but marbles and half-eaten bread. A chaplain named Captain Lutz wrote in his diary that night, "They were little more than ghosts. One boy saluted me and asked if I was going to shoot him. When I said no, he cried until he fell asleep." For the Americans, the war was almost over. For the boys, it was the end of the world. Everything they had believed, every poster, every lesson, every speech, was unraveling before their eyes. They had been told that the Allied soldiers were demons, that surrender meant disgrace, that the Führer would never abandon them. Yet here were those same enemies, handing them soup and blankets, speaking softly as though addressing sons. That night, Hans sat in a captured barn with 20 other boys. The Americans had lit a stove, and the scent of stew filled the air. Steam rose from tin bowls. Hans watched the red-bearded soldier ladle broth into each one, smiling slightly as if he were serving his own family. The soldier's name tag read, Sergeant Miller. Hans didn't understand the words Miller spoke, but the tone, calm, fatherly, was unmistakable. He felt something warm flicker inside him, fragile and strange. Outside, the last artillery boomed in the distance, echoing like a dying heartbeat. Inside, the boys ate in silence. Some stared at the floor, ashamed. Others devoured their food with trembling hands. Hans took a second bite, then a third, tasting life returning to his tongue. He remembered his father, dead on the Eastern Front, and wondered if the man before him, the enemy who had spared him, might have had sons his age back in America. As the stove crackled, one of the younger boys whispered, "Do you think they'll let us go home?" Another answered, "If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead already." The words hung in the air like smoke. For the first time, Hans realized the war might truly end, and that survival would mean unlearning everything he had been taught. Later, when the soldiers led them to a makeshift camp, Hans glanced back at the horizon. The sky glowed faintly red where Nuremberg burned. The empire his teachers had sworn would last forever was now just dust and flame. And yet, as he walked among his captors, he felt something unfamiliar: safety. The Americans searched their pockets for weapons but found only childish things: drawings, buttons, a photograph of a mother. One GI lifted a torn picture from Hans's coat, a woman smiling beside a small boy. The soldier studied it, then carefully handed it back. "You'll see her again," he said quietly. Hans didn't understand the words, but he recognized the kindness in the voice. He nodded, holding the picture close. In that moment, a strange reversal took root, a war built on hate giving birth to an act of mercy. The Americans, weary and homesick, saw their own sons in the defeated faces of their enemies. The German boys, conditioned for fanaticism, met compassion that shattered every lie they had been told. When night fell, the camp lights shimmered over barbed wire and sleeping forms wrapped in army blankets. Somewhere in the dark, Hans whispered a word he hadn't spoken in months: "Mama." The soldier on watch looked over, then tossed another blanket his way. The boy pulled it close, breathing in the faint scent of soap and tobacco. He didn't know it yet, but that night was the beginning of something larger than surrender. It was the first step toward rediscovery, toward realizing that the men who conquered them had not come to destroy, but to remind them what being human meant. As dawn crept over the ruined fields, the fog lifted, and the distant church bells rang for the first time in weeks. The boys stirred, blinking in the pale light. Some smiled without knowing why. And far beyond the camp fences, in the direction of home, the wind carried a new sound, not gunfire, not marching songs, but the fragile hum of peace beginning to breathe again. Hans stared toward it, clutching the blanket around his shoulders. The Americans had spared his life, but what he could not yet understand was that they were about to do something far more powerful. They were going to give it meaning. The spring rain came softly over Bavaria, washing soot from the rooftops and the last symbols of a dying empire. The war was over, but the children of that war were not. Across the countryside, trucks rattled toward makeshift camps, each one filled with boys who had once been soldiers. Some still wore the remnants of their uniforms: Hitler Youth insignias, torn armbands, badges for bravery no one remembered awarding. Now, stripped of weapons, they sat shoulder to shoulder, too small for their guilt, too quiet for their age. Among them sat Hans, 13, watching the hills roll by through a film of drizzle. The rifle that had once defined him was gone. In its place, he held an empty canteen like a keepsake from another life. When the convoy stopped at a field camp outside Würzburg, the boys were ordered to step out. American soldiers, raincoats glistening, guided them toward rows of canvas tents. The air smelled of wet hay and gasoline. The boys expected harshness, shouts, punishment, humiliation, but the tone was calm, almost routine. "You'll get food soon," one soldier said, his German clumsy but kind. Another offered them cigarettes. None of the boys knew how to refuse. They were too busy trying to reconcile what they saw: the enemy laughing, the enemy helping, the enemy behaving like men rather than monsters. Inside the camp, army medics examined them one by one. Some of the younger boys flinched when touched. Others stared blankly as doctors cleaned their wounds. A nurse, her uniform crisp despite the mud, knelt to bandage a scraped knee. "Too young," she murmured in English. Hans didn't understand the words, but her voice carried something maternal. He felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. By evening, the boys were gathered in a mess tent that smelled of broth and soap. Tin plates clattered, and a soldier ladled stew into each bowl. It was hot, rich, and thick with vegetables. For many, it was the first real meal in weeks. Hans hesitated before eating. He remembered lessons about poisoned rations, propaganda leaflets warning that surrender meant death by deceit. But the stew's warmth broke through fear. He took one cautious spoonful, then another. Around him, heads bowed not in salute but in silent disbelief. As night fell, the camp settled under a quilt of mist. The boys were issued blankets, dry clothes, and, astonishingly, socks. They slept in rows, their breathing steady, punctuated by soft murmurs and dreams. Outside, American sentries smoked by lantern light, talking about home: Texas, Ohio, Kansas. Hans listened through the tent flap, catching only fragments: wife, boy, baseball. The words felt foreign yet strangely soothing. Days blurred into a rhythm of order and mercy. The children were deloused, vaccinated, and given soap, luxuries they hadn't known in years. Some stared at the bar of soap as if it were gold. The Americans called them kids, a word both unfamiliar and disarming. It carried no rank, no obligation, no ideology, just a quiet acceptance that they were not soldiers anymore. One morning, Chaplain Lutz visited the camp. He was middle-aged, with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose and a Bible worn from use. He gathered the boys under a large oak tree and spoke in simple, careful German. "The war is over," he said. "You are safe now." The statement fell like sunlight after endless rain. Some of the older boys looked away, unwilling to show relief. Others wept openly. Hans stared at the chaplain, unsure whether to believe him. Safety was a concept that felt almost mythical. Later that day, Sergeant Miller returned, the same red-bearded man who had first given Hans chocolate. He brought with him a crate of supplies: apples, notebooks, and something that made the camp erupt with laughter: baseballs. The GIs cleared a patch of ground and began showing the boys how to throw and catch. Awkward arms flailed, laughter rang out, and for a moment, the war dissolved into a simple game. Hans stood at the edge, hesitant. Miller tossed him a glove. "Try," he said. Hans caught the ball badly, dropping it with a thud. The sergeant grinned. "Good. Now again." It was the first time anyone had encouraged him without shouting. As the days warmed, the camp transformed. The barbed wire fences no longer felt like prison walls but like boundaries between the past and something uncertainly better. Some boys began helping in the kitchen, learning English phrases. "Thank you, good soup, my name is—" When Red Cross volunteers arrived, they brought books, crayons, and small wooden toys. One nurse, a woman from Illinois, noticed Hans sketching on a scrap of paper and found him a notebook. "For your thoughts," she said. He didn't know the word thoughts, but he understood the gesture. Each act of kindness confused them as much as it comforted them. These were the same Americans who had bombed their towns, who had crushed the army they had worshipped. How could the victors be so gentle? One boy asked Miller why they were being treated so well. The sergeant paused, then answered simply, "Because you're kids. And kids deserve a chance to grow up." The words lingered long after he left. Not all moments were easy. Some of the boys still whispered Hitler's name at night, afraid of betraying their indoctrination. A few drew swastikas on the dirt, only to have American soldiers quietly wash them away. Lutz gathered them again, explaining that symbols could die, but people could live differently. Hate is learned, he said, and so is love. It wasn't a sermon, it was a lifeline. Hans began to change without realizing it. He no longer flinched when spoken to. He started sharing food, laughing at the soldiers' jokes, even mimicking their accents. In the evenings, he and the others sang along to a scratchy radio that played American songs, strange, melodic tunes about places like Tennessee and Chicago. The boys didn't understand the lyrics, but the music carried a promise of normalcy. One night, Miller sat beside Hans by the fire, polishing his boots. "You remind me of my son," he said softly. Hans didn't catch the meaning, but when Miller ruffled his hair, he smiled shyly. It was the first fatherly gesture he had felt since his own father's death. Something in him, hard and small as a stone, began to crack. By June, many of the boys were transferred to larger rehabilitation camps. Some were to be sent home, others kept longer for recovery. The Americans made sure they carried warm clothes, food rations, and papers certifying their release. Before departure, Chaplain Lutz gathered them one last time. "Remember," he said, "the world you knew is gone. But you can choose what kind of men you'll become." As the trucks lined up, Hans looked back at the camp, the tents, the oak tree, the men who had fed and forgiven them. In the distance, Miller raised a hand. Hans waved back, clutching the glove the sergeant had given him. He didn't know the word for gratitude, but he felt it deep in his chest, sharp and overwhelming. As the convoy rolled toward the horizon, the boys sat silently, watching the landscape blur. The fences of captivity were behind them now, but something unexpected had taken root inside them, a seed of belonging, fragile yet alive. They were still orphans of a lost war, but for the first time they were also children again. What none of them knew, as the wind whipped across the truck beds, was that years later, many would still write to the men and women of those camps, letters beginning not with "Dear Sir," but with "Dear Father" and "Dear Mother." For though their war had ended, their longing for family had only just begun. The summer sun hung low over Bavaria, warm and gold against a land still haunted by ashes. By July 1945, the camps no longer smelled of smoke and iron, but of bread baking and laundry drying in the wind. The boys, once shadows in uniform, had grown into something almost recognizable as youth. Yet beneath the laughter there lingered confusion, a quiet disbelief that mercy could follow such horror. For Hans, the shock of kindness had become its own kind of battle. Every morning began the same. The clatter of tin bowls, the sound of a bugle in the distance, the low hum of men talking in English. Hans stood in line with other boys, his stomach growling as the mess sergeant poured porridge into his bowl. "Eat up, kid," the man would say, and Hans would nod, mimicking the words softly. Kid. He'd learned what it meant. It wasn't an insult, it was a reminder that he was no longer a soldier. The camp had changed. Gardens sprouted near the barrack. The Red Cross had sent books and paper. Some of the boys drew pictures, others learned simple English phrases. A blackboard had been nailed to the wall of an old stable, where a kind-eyed nurse named Evelyn taught them to write their names. She smelled faintly of soap and lilac, a scent so gentle that Hans sometimes caught himself breathing deeply when she passed. When she smiled, the boys forgot for a moment that the world had ever been cruel. But not all could accept it. One afternoon Karl, a thin 16-year-old with sharp eyes, refused to join the others for a lesson. "They're mocking us," he muttered in German. "They want us to forget who we are." Hans didn't answer. He wanted to believe otherwise, but the thought gnawed at him. Were they being re-educated or rescued? The line between the two blurred like the horizon after rain. Later that day, the Americans held a small ceremony under the oak tree. The chaplain read aloud a letter from the U.S. Army Command. All child combatants are to be treated as victims of war, not perpetrators. The words rolled over the crowd like music none of them had ever heard. Victims, not enemies. The boys looked at one another, uncertain how to carry that label. Victims were weak. They had been trained to despise weakness. Yet, standing there in clean shirts and full bellies, they realized that weakness had kept them alive. After the reading, Sergeant Miller appeared with a basket of apples. He handed them out, tossing one to each boy. "Peace tastes better than gunpowder," he joked. A ripple of laughter followed. Hans bit into his apple, juice running down his chin, and for a heartbeat, he was just a boy again. Then he remembered his mother starving in the ruins of Munich, and felt guilty for the sweetness. That night, thunder rolled over the hills, and rain swept across the camp. The boys huddled inside their barracks, listening to the storm. Evelyn came in carrying a lantern and extra blankets. "Stay warm," she said, her German halting but kind. Hans watched her kneel beside a sick boy, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. The flickering light framed her face like something holy. For so long, the only tenderness they had known came with conditions: obedience, ideology, or fear. Now it came freely, and it unsettled them more than violence ever had. The next morning, the storm passed, leaving puddles that mirrored the sky. The camp buzzed with quiet energy. Miller and 2 other soldiers set up a makeshift kitchen, letting the boys help stir pots and wash dishes. "If you can fight," Miller said, "you can cook." The boys laughed, proud to be useful. The smell of stew drifted through the air, mingling with the sharp scent of wet pine. Hans stirred a pot too long, lost in thought. Miller came up behind him. "Back home, my kid burns everything," he said with a grin. Hans smiled shyly, not understanding all the words but sensing their warmth. Miller handed him a small photograph, a boy of about 10, standing beside a golden retriever. "My son," he explained. "He's waiting for me." Hans studied the picture. The boy's smile was open, unguarded. It looked like a different world entirely. Miller pointed at Hans, then at the photo, saying softly, "Same age." The gesture pierced deeper than any speech. Hans nodded, the corners of his mouth trembling. Days turned into weeks, and the small acts multiplied. Soldiers shared their rations of chocolate, nurses braided the younger boys' hair, chaplains organized soccer games on Sundays. Laughter became common, hesitant at first, then steady, like an engine that had finally caught spark. Yet beneath the surface, guilt pulsed. How could they accept kindness from those they'd been told were their destroyers? One evening, a radio broadcast played across the camp, President Truman's voice announcing the end of hostilities in the Pacific. The Americans cheered, tossing hats in the air. The German boys watched, uncertain whether to join. Hans stood at the edge, hands clenched. The sound of victory, someone else's victory, felt like both an ending and a beginning. Evelyn noticed him and knelt down. "It's over," she whispered. "No more war." Hans looked up, eyes wet. "For us too?" he asked in halting English. "For everyone," she said. The next day, a Red Cross truck arrived with mail and supplies. Some boys received letters from surviving relatives, others received nothing but silence. Hans's name was never called. That night, he sat alone by the fence, staring at the stars. Miller joined him, offering a piece of bread spread with peanut butter. "No letter?" he asked gently. Hans shook his head. "Family gone." The soldier nodded, eyes soft. "Then you've got one here, kid." He said it casually, almost offhand, but the words struck Hans like thunder in the chest. 4 days after, the boy repeated them in his mind. "You've got one here." It was a sentence that redefined the world. He began helping more, laughing easier, even teasing the Americans with his broken English. When Evelyn caught him teaching another boy to say, "Please," and "Thank you," she smiled. "You're a good teacher," she said. Hans shrugged, embarrassed. "Good student first," he replied. But peace did not erase the past. Occasionally, visitors arrived, officers inspecting, journalists taking notes, Red Cross officials counting heads. One asked Hans what he wanted to be when he grew up. He hesitated, then said in halting English, "Kind." The man smiled politely, not realizing the weight of the word. Kindness had been the weapon that disarmed him, the revolution that no ideology had prepared him for. By late summer, the camp's fences had become almost symbolic. The guards no longer watched closely. Some boys walked to nearby villages to help rebuild houses. They returned with stories of farmers who shared milk, of children who played without fear. Yet when Hans passed through the gate, he always looked back. The camp, once a cage, had become something sacred, a place where enemies had chosen to become human again. One evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, Miller gathered his men. "We're being reassigned," he announced. "The boys will go home soon." Cheers erupted from the Americans, but the German children fell silent. Home. The word no longer meant the same thing. For Hans, home was wherever he had felt safe, wherever someone remembered his name. As darkness deepened, he found Miller by the truck, loading crates. "You go?" Hans asked. The sergeant nodded. "Tomorrow morning." Hans hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the baseball glove he'd been given weeks earlier. He pressed it into Miller's hands. "For your boy," he said softly. Miller's eyes glistened. "He'll know who it's from." When dawn came, the trucks rolled out through the gate. The boys stood watching, silent as the engines faded into the horizon. In the stillness that followed, Hans felt a strange ache. Not loss exactly, but recognition. The men who had once conquered him had become the measure of everything good he hoped to be. He looked down at his hands, clean, steady, alive. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. For the first time, he didn't think of war or hunger. He thought of kindness, and how terrifying, how miraculous it was to be saved by it. The war had been over for months, yet its echoes still lingered in the soft hum of post-war Europe, the clatter of rebuilding, the hollow spaces where fathers should have been, and the quiet scraping of pencils on paper. It began with a single letter. In October 1945, in a refugee shelter near Stuttgart, a 13-year-old boy named Hans borrowed a stub of a pencil and a sheet of Red Cross stationery. He stared at the blank page for nearly an hour before writing in uneven English, "Dear Sergeant Miller, I hope you are safe. I am good boy now. Thank you for the blanket. I sleep warm." He folded it carefully, sealed it with trembling hands, and handed it to a nurse who promised to send it overseas. He did not know it then, but his small act of gratitude would become part of a flood of letters, hundreds of them, pouring out of a broken nation toward the men and women who had once been its conquerors. In towns across Germany, the former child soldiers were trying to remember how to live. Some returned to find their families gone, their houses reduced to stone shells. Others wandered between orphanages and farms, searching for a familiar face that no longer existed. The Americans, long redeployed home, had faded into memory, yet their kindness had lodged deep, like a seed waiting for spring. And when the Red Cross offered to help send correspondence abroad, the children began to write. They wrote in halting English and shaky German, sometimes mixing both in the same sentence. "Dear Mama Evelyn, I learned school again," one read. "Dear Captain Lutz, I pray now before eat." Like you say. The letters carried small treasures, pressed flowers, charcoal sketches, photographs cut from newspapers. They spoke of ordinary miracles, warm meals, peace, the strangeness of laughter returning to their throats. Postal clerks sorting the mail called them the thank you letters, but for many of the boys, they were something else entirely, a bridge back to family. In Kansas, Sergeant Miller's wife found Hans's letter among a bundle of veterans' mail. She called to her husband, who was fixing a fence behind their house. When he opened the envelope, the handwriting was childish, the sentences simple. But halfway down the page, he stopped and read aloud, "You say I have family here. I think may be true." Miller folded the letter and stared at the horizon. That evening, he wrote back, "Dear Hans, I'm glad you are safe. You always had a home here. My boy asks about you. He says when he grows up, he wants to play baseball with you." Over the next few years, letters crossed the ocean like small lifelines. The boys grew older, their handwriting steadier, their English more confident. Hans wrote about working on a farm outside Augsburg, about how the smell of bread now reminded him of the camp kitchens, about the first Christmas he spent without fear. He signed each note, "Your German son, Hans." Miller kept them all in a tin box, the metal worn smooth from opening and closing. Others did the same. In Illinois, Nurse Evelyn received Christmas cards for nearly a decade from boys who addressed her as Mama or Aunt. One included a black and white photograph. 3 young men standing before a rebuilt school, smiling awkwardly at the camera. On the back a message read, "You teach us how to read. We teach others now." She pinned it to her kitchen wall, next to a photo of her own children. When asked who they were, she simply said, "My other sons." In 1951, a small feature in the Stars and Stripes newspaper told of these correspondences, how former German child soldiers, once enemies, had become pen pals to the very soldiers who captured them. The article quoted one letter that read, "You were the first people who were kind to me. I thought you would kill me, but you made me a boy again." The story spread quietly, shared in veterans' halls and Sunday sermons, a rare spark of grace in a decade shadowed by the Cold War. For Hans, the letters became a ritual. Every spring, he wrote to the Millers. He told them when he got his first real job, when he bought a bicycle, when he planted apple trees behind his small house. He ended every note the same way, "Thank you for teaching me that the enemy can be good." One winter, he received a package in return, a baseball signed by Miller's son, now a teenager. Inside was a note, "You're part of our team, no matter how far away you are." Years rolled on. Europe healed in fragments. Factories rose, borders shifted, and the children of war became fathers themselves. But the letters did not stop. Even decades later, some continued to arrive, yellowed and creased, written in careful script that began with "Dear Mom" or "Dear Dad." Archivists who found them in veterans' estates were startled by their tenderness. One historian would later write, "These correspondences revealed something extraordinary, that mercy had done what treaties could not. It had rewritten loyalty." In 1960, Hans finally saved enough to travel to America. He took a ship across the Atlantic, clutching a worn photograph of Sergeant Miller. When he arrived in New York Harbor, he felt both terrified and alive. The journey by train to Kansas was long, the landscape unfamiliar. But when he stepped off at a small station, he saw an older man waiting, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, wearing the same easy smile that had once handed him a baseball glove. They did not speak at first. They simply stood there, and then Miller pulled him into an embrace. "Welcome home, son," he said. They spent that week talking on the porch, piecing together their lives. Miller showed him the tin box of letters, still carefully kept. Hans showed him a photograph of his own family, a wife, 2 children, one named Charles. "After you," he explained. Miller blinked away tears. "Guess we both did all right," he said softly. When Hans returned to Germany, he carried more than souvenirs. He carried the realization that nations could fall, but kindness could outlast borders. The boy who had once believed enemies were monsters now believed something far simpler, that goodness, when offered without demand, could survive even the ruins of ideology. In later years, as old soldiers passed away, museums began collecting their correspondence. Boxes of letters, faded and fragile, were displayed under glass, testimonies of a generation who learned peace not from speeches but from human touch. One exhibit bore a simple title, "From Captives to Children." Hans visited once, standing quietly before his own letters. His reflection merged with the glass, his handwriting hovering like a ghost beside his aging face. A small boy nearby asked him if he had really been one of those children. "Yes," Hans said, smiling faintly. "But I was lucky. I met people who showed me what family meant." The child nodded, not fully understanding, and ran back to his mother. As the museum lights dimmed, Hans lingered a moment longer. In the silence, he imagined Miller's voice, steady and warm. "You've got one here, kid. It echoed through time like a promise kept. Outside, the evening sun touched the roofs of the new Germany, bright, unscarred, alive. He looked up at it, eyes shining, whispering a word that still felt foreign on his tongue. Home. And though the world around him had changed beyond recognition, the lesson had not. The greatest victory of that war had never been written in treaties or carved into monuments. It had been handwritten, sealed with trust, and addressed across an ocean, to those who once called themselves enemies, and later learned to call each other family.